Imagine an ordinary wooden box about the size of a small suitcase. The design was extremely simple, a rotating cylinder with sharp metal teeth and a side handle. At first glance, nothing remarkable, right? Yet this very device fundamentally changed the lives of 6 million human beings. It split a united nation. It became the catalyst for a bloody armed conflict in which more American citizens died than in all other wars of the United States combined. The starting point of events, 1793, when a young teacher named Eli Whitney arrived in Georgia seeking employment. 1793. Virginia. The economic foundation of the young American Republic was in deep decline. The lands of Virginia, exhausted by decades of tobacco farming, were rapidly losing their natural fertility. Demand for Carolina rice and indigo had already reached its limit. Transporting goods was painfully slow and extremely expensive. The young republic found itself in a dead end. Thomas Jefferson stands on the veranda of his estate, Monticello, looking out across the fields. What he sees fills him with dread. The soil is exhausted. Decades of tobacco cultivation have drained it of life. Harvests shrink year after year. Plantations that once produced enormous wealth now barely cover their costs. Jefferson is not only a major landowner, he is one of the founding fathers of the nation, and he clearly understands the economic system of the country is collapsing. Look at the numbers. In 1790, the entire southern economy relied on three main crops: tobacco, but Virginia soil was no longer fertile; rice, but it could only grow along the narrow coastal strip of South Carolina; indigo, a dye plant with very limited demand. The transportation system was primitive. Roads were muddy paths, rivers barely navigable. Delivering goods from plantation to port could take weeks. Logistics costs consumed nearly all potential profit. At that time, there were two main types of cotton: long staple with silky fibers, seeds easily separated, but it only grew on the wet coastal islands. Its production volumes were minimal, only a few thousand pounds annually. Short staple cotton, extremely resilient and undemanding, able to grow everywhere on rolling hills, in river valleys, on the red clay of Georgia and the fertile black soil of Mississippi. Its potential was enormous, but there was one deadly obstacle. The seeds were covered with a sticky green coating that clung tightly to the fibers. Separating them by hand was pure hell. One worker could process a maximum of 1 pound per day. Imagine working from dawn to dusk, picking sticky cotton bolls and extracting each seed by hand. Fingers bleeding from strain, back aching unbearably. At the end of the workday, you would have only a pitiful 450 grams of clean fiber. At such low productivity, growing cotton made no economic sense. Eli Whitney was 28 when he arrived at Catherine Green Estate in Georgia. He was a recent Yale graduate hoping to find a teaching position, but fate had other plans. One evening at dinner, local landowners lamented an old problem, one that had plagued them for years. Cotton, one planter said. If anyone could invent a machine that efficiently cleans cotton, he would become the richest man in the entire South. Eli Whitney listened closely. 10 days later, he built the first working prototype. Its design was brilliant in its simplicity: a wooden rotating drum with metal hooks, a special metal grid with very narrow slits, and a brush to remove cleaned fibers. You place raw cotton in the hopper, turn the side handle. The drum starts spinning, the hooks catch the fibers and pull them through the narrow slits of the grid. The seeds, being too large, stay behind the barrier. Clean fibers are carefully swept with a brush into a prepared basket. That's it. One person operating such a machine could process 50 pounds of raw cotton in a single day. This was 50 times more efficient than manual labor. Later, using water wheel or horsepower, the machine output reached 1,000 pounds per day. It was not merely a new technical device, it was a true economic explosion. News of the invention spread across the southern states like wildfire. Farmers who had previously barely made ends meet suddenly saw an incredible opportunity. Lands that had once been considered useless instantly turned into real gold mines. Look at the numbers. In 1790, the United States produced 1.5 million pounds of cotton. By 1800, it was 35 million. In 1820, 160 million. By 1840, 800 million. In 1860, 2,300 million pounds. Over 70 years, production increased 1,500 times. This was not just growth in numbers, it was a massive economic tsunami. However, there was a problem that no one dared to speak of at the time. Whitney invention significantly sped up only one stage of the process: cleaning the harvested cotton. But cotton still had to be planted by hand, weeded by hand, and picked by hand. Each cotton boll matures at its own time. You couldn't simply mow down the entire field with a machine. It is necessary to constantly walk between the rows. carefully inspect each individual plant, and pick only the ripened bolls. This is exhausting, monotonous, and endless work under the scorching sun. And the more cotton planters tried to produce, the more hands they needed. To fully grasp the scale of what happened, we need to rise above the land and look at the Atlantic Ocean from above. Imagine a map before you. 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and America. And between them lie trade routes forming a giant triangle. First leg, America to Europe. Ships leave the ports of Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. Their holds are packed to the brim with dense bales of cotton. Destination: Liverpool, Manchester, or Le Havre. Time at sea: 3 to 4 weeks. Second leg, Europe to Africa. Cotton is completely unloaded. Ships are loaded with manufactured goods, fabrics, rifles, gunpowder, alcohol, and various metal products. Destination: the west coast of Africa. The voyage takes 2 to 3 weeks. Third leg, Africa to America. The imported goods are exchanged for live human cargo. Ship holds are converted into cramped floating prisons. 300 or 400 people are confined in a space comparable to a tennis court. People are in chains, living in their own waste. The direction: West Indies, then the southern states. The journey lasts 6 to 8 weeks. Mortality during the crossing reaches 15 to 20%. This agricultural boom was not solely a local story of the South. It became a catalyst for global industrial processes on both sides of the Atlantic. Textile factories in Manchester, England, were critically dependent on American cotton supplies. By the mid-19th century, cotton accounted for more than half of the entire export volume of the United States. The northern states were also deeply entwined in this economic system. Boston banking institutions readily provided loans to acquire new agricultural lands. New England shipyards built fast clippers to transport bales of cotton across the ocean. New York insurance companies insured maritime risks and freight contracts. Expanding production required a constant increase in labor force. Mechanization only helped in processing the already harvested raw cotton. Planting, weeding, and picking cotton bolls remained exhausting physical labor. The plantation economy was built on minimizing costs and maximizing productivity. Human labor was considered solely as investment capital. Its value was calculated mathematically based on the potential yield of a particular region. By the early 1800s, the transatlantic import of enslaved people was legally restricted. The domestic labor market then fully reoriented toward the needs of expanding cotton plantations. A massive migration of labor occurred from the declining tobacco coast to the fertile lands of the Deep South. This system generated enormous profits, but to maintain its stability, the rules had to be clearly defined. Economic gain required a solid legal foundation, and that foundation was the law. As early as 1619, the status of the first Africans in North America was legally unclear. Many worked under the same conditions as European indentured servants. After several years of labor, some gained freedom and even land. Initially, the system remained flexible, but the growing economy required long-term control over labor. In 1662, the Virginia Assembly passed a brief but fateful law. Henceforth, the status of a newborn child would be determined by the status of its mother. This rule violated centuries of English legal tradition, where descent followed the father. Biological reproduction now became a lawful means of creating capital. Slavery became hereditary. Soon, new laws followed. Colonial codes gradually stripped people of basic rights. Enslaved individuals were forbidden from carrying weapons, gathering without supervision, or testifying in court against white citizens. By the early 1700s, the legal concept of property was firmly established. In the law, a person was equated with a cart, a tool, or livestock. Enslaved people could not sign contracts. Their marriages had no legal standing and were not protected by the state. Families could be separated at any moment by the decision of an owner, or by court judgment for debts. A person could be used as collateral for a bank loan, inherited, leased, or even gambled away. In 1740, South Carolina passed a strict code directly prohibiting teaching slaves to read or write. The legal system began creating an information vacuum. Fragmented colonial laws required a unified standard as the new nation took shape. In 1787, delegates at the Constitutional Convention faced a difficult demographic problem. Southern states wanted all their population counted for the purpose of representation in the House. Northern delegates strongly opposed it. Counting slaves would give the South enormous political power. The parties reached what became known as the 3/5 Compromise. The formula was simple. Every 5 slaves were counted as 3 free persons for purposes of representation. This fraction gave no rights to the enslaved themselves. It simply increased the South's influence in Congress and the Electoral College. This legal maneuver guaranteed the South disproportionate power for decades to come. Interestingly, the Constitution never directly used the word slave. Its authors relied on indirect language, other persons or persons held to service. Behind this cautious wording lay pure pragmatism. Article 4 also required fugitive slaves to be returned to their owners, even from free states. Property rights became extraterritorial. People were locked inside a rigid legal cage, stripped of any personal freedom. In total isolation and without rights, they had to find other ways to communicate. Plantations united people from a variety of West African cultures: Wolof, Yoruba, Igbo, Ashanti. To survive, they needed a new language. English words began mixing with African grammar. From this mixture, new Creole dialects emerged. One of the most famous was Gullah on the Atlantic coast. It allowed people to speak openly even in front of overseers. Its unusual pronunciation and altered sentence structure were not signs of ignorance. They were tools of encryption. Since literacy was forbidden, cultural memory fully shifted into oral tradition. Stories about the trickster, a clever outsider like Br'er Rabbit, emerged. These tales were not merely entertainment. They were survival manuals, teaching how to avoid direct confrontation and exploit the weaknesses of the system itself. The soundscape of the fields also changed. Songs helped synchronize movements, using a call-and-response structure. When drums were banned by owners, people adapted. The patting juba technique turned the human body into a percussion instrument. Claps, hip slaps, foot stomps, all combined into intricate rhythms that would later become the foundation of entire musical genres. Even church services meant to teach obedience produced a different outcome. Biblical stories took on new meanings. Spirituals, deeply emotional songs, often carried double meanings. On the surface, they sounded like prayers. In reality, they were systems of coded navigation. Egypt meant the South. Pharaoh, the slave owner. Moses, the guide to freedom. The Jordan, the Ohio River, the border with free states. Canaan, the North. The song "Steal Away to Jesus" could signal a secret meeting. Wade in the Water gave practical advice to throw dogs off the trail. The song about the drinking gourd served as a star map, pointing to the Big Dipper whose stars led north. Culture replaced institutions, creating an invisible network leading to freedom. The North entered a new phase. At the beginning of the 19th century, lands north of the Ohio River entered the age of steam. A strange paradox emerged. Northern industrial progress did not destroy the plantation economy, but strengthened it. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, reducing transport costs by 90%. The North formed a unified economic system. Textile mills in Massachusetts, steel production in Pennsylvania, New York as the financial capital all grew. The South, however, lagged behind. Plantation owners had no incentive to build factories. Two different strategies emerged. The North invested in technology and stocks, the South in land and people. By mid-century, the North was covered with a dense railway network, while southern routes were short and led only to ports. Demographics were also shifting. Immigrants from Europe traveled north for factory work. In the South, free labor could not compete with unpaid labor. The flow of people bypassed the region. When in 1848 the United States acquired new lands all the way to the Pacific, the question became urgent: would slavery exist there? Two economic worlds collided. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But freedom came without land or money. The South lay in ruins. Sharecropping emerged, quickly turning into a debt trap. Debts often passed from parents to children. Physical chains disappeared, but financial pressure bound people to the land. Nevertheless, a battle for education began. Literacy became a symbol of freedom. Universities opened. Fisk, Howard Booker T. Washington, founded a school in Tuskegee. But when federal troops withdrew in 1877, a rollback began. Black codes, poll taxes, stagnation. Then history opened a door. In 1914, the war in Europe reduced immigration, and northern factories faced labor shortages. At the same time, the cotton boll weevil was destroying southern crops. The Chicago Defender newspaper called for relocation. The Great Migration began. 6 million people moved north following the railroads: Mississippi, Chicago, Alabama, Detroit, Virginia, New York. There they found work, but faced redlining and inflated rents. Yet it was in the crowded streets of Harlem and Brownsville that culture exploded. The Harlem Renaissance, blues, rock and roll, all were born there. Demography became political power. This long journey shaped the nation identity. History is not a list of dates, it is a living process, echoing in the rhythms of modern cities. The past does not vanish, it lives in our institutions and every heartbeat of contemporary America. And this path to freedom continues today. Plantation owners were gripped by a cotton fever like the California gold rush of 1849, but here the gold grew from the land. Virginia and the Carolinas, the Old South, exhausted tobacco fields, aristocratic families, traditions. But to the west lay virgin territories. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. The land there was cheap, soil black and fertile, a long growing season, perfect conditions for short staple cotton. Mass land migration began. Planters sold old estates and moved west. Following them came convoys, livestock, tools, seeds, and people. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved individuals, torn from their homes and families. Forests were cleared at a furious pace. Swamps drained. Fields laid out in neat squares as far as the eye could see. The Cotton Belt emerged, a vast strip of land stretching from the Carolinas to Texas. Thousands of square miles covered with a white sea of ripening cotton. But this was no rural idyll, it was an industry. A tightly organized, ruthlessly efficient capitalist machine. By 1850, cotton accounted for over 50% of the entire export of the United States, more than all other goods combined. This made America a critical player in the global economy. The textile mills of Manchester, the heart of the British Industrial Revolution, were entirely dependent on American cotton. Every morning, thousands of workers arrived at factories to turn raw cotton, harvested by enslaved hands in Mississippi, into fabric sold around the world. British bankers financed Southern planters. British insurance companies insured cotton shipments. The British fleet protected trade routes. The full economic might of the British Empire, the workshop of the world, rested on the foundation of American slavery. Wall Street banks issued loans secured by future harvests. Insurance companies insured not only the goods but the enslaved people themselves as movable property. Boston and New England, the textile mills of Lowell and Lawrence processed Southern cotton. Shipyards built fast clippers for transatlantic trade. The Midwest farmers in Ohio and Kentucky supplied food, salted pork, flour, corn for Southern plantations. The entire country, from Maine to Texas, was linked by the invisible threads of the cotton economy. At the center of this economy were people, not as workers, not as citizens, as commodities. Slavery became self-reproducing. The human body turned into a factory for producing new capital. Laws followed. 1669, Virginia, killing an enslaved person during correction was not considered a crime. 1705, Virginia enslaved people were prohibited from carrying weapons, assembling without white permission, leaving the plantation without a written pass, or testifying in court against whites. Legally, by 1750, their status was fixed. An enslaved person was movable property, like a chair, a plow, or a cow. They could not own property, sign contracts, or marry legally. Their marriage was not recognized by law. Families could be separated at any moment. They could be bought, sold, exchanged, leased, inherited, used as collateral for a loan, or gambled away. The Constitution never directly used the word slave. The framers relied on euphemisms: other persons, persons bound to service. Why? Because the Founding Fathers understood the moral problem. They were building a republic based on ideas of freedom and equality, and simultaneously enshrined slavery in its Constitution. This internal contradiction would fester at the heart of the nation for the next 78 years until it exploded in the bloodiest war in American history. From 1780 to 1860, 72 years, the presidents of the United States were slaveholders for 50 of those years. More than two-thirds of the time. Virginia, the largest slaveholding state, gave the country 4 of the first 5 presidents. The 3/5 compromise gave slaveholding states an additional 20 to 30 seats in the House and 15 to 20 extra electoral votes. This political power blocked all anti-slavery legislation for decades. The song "Follow the Drinking Gourd" was literally a star map. When the sun returns and the first quail cries spring, the best time to escape. Follow the gourd, head north by the stars. The river ends between 2 hills, a specific geographic marker along the route. To the planter, it sounded like an innocent religious song. To those who knew the code, it was 19th century navigation. The North entered the Industrial Age. Massachusetts textile mills, Pennsylvania steel, New York finance, all were growing. The South remained agricultural. Plantation owners had no incentive to build factories. 2 strategies: the North invested in technology and stocks, the South in land and people. By mid-century, the North was covered with a dense railway network. Southern rails were short, leading only to export ports. Demographics shifted. European immigrants went north for factory work. In the South, free labor could not compete with slave labor. The flow of immigration bypassed the region. When in 1848 the United States acquired lands to the Pacific, the question became critical: would slavery expand? Two economic worlds were on a collision course. Kansas became a battlefield. Bleeding Kansas, they called it. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured in. Violence erupted, cities burned, people killed each other. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Republican, opposed to the expansion of slavery. The South saw a threat. Within months, 11 Southern states seceded. They formed the Confederate States of America. On April 12, 1861, Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War began. It lasted 4 years. 620,000 dead, more than all other U.S. wars combined before Vietnam. On January 1, 1865, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. On December 18, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Read carefully. Except as a punishment for crime, this exception became a loophole through which the system of control would return in a new form. But first, a brief moment of hope. Reconstruction, 1865–1877. Federal troops occupied the South. For the first time in history, black men gained the right to vote. They were elected to state legislatures and Congress. Schools opened. Literacy, forbidden for 200 years, suddenly became possible. Universities were founded. Fisk, Howard, Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington became a symbol of education and self-reliance. But freedom came without resources. General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15. Confiscated plantations were to be divided into 40-acre plots and given to freed families. 40 acres and a mule, this phrase became a symbol of promise. But the promise was not kept. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded the assassinated Lincoln, returned the land to its former owners. 4 million people became free, but without land, without money, without tools, without education. What were they to do? The sharecropping system emerged. You worked a plot of land, the owner provided seeds, tools, housing. You grew cotton. After harvest, you gave the owner half or more. From your half, debts were deducted for rent, tools, food. The owner usually ran the only store in the county, set the prices, kept the records. The illiterate sharecropper could not verify them. Predictable outcome: at the end of the season, you owed money. Again, debt grew, passed from father to son. You could not leave until the debt was paid, but the debt never ended. Add the Black Codes, laws of Southern states enacted right after the war, prohibition on vagrancy, any black person without work could be arrested, prohibition on changing jobs without employer permission. Apprentice laws allowed children to be taken into forced labor. Then came Jim Crow laws, segregation in schools, transport, restaurants, hospitals, literacy tests for voting with deliberately impossible questions. The poll tax, a fee the poor could not pay. The grandfather clause, only those whose grandfathers could vote were allowed, excluding all black people. In 1877, the last federal troops left the South. Reconstruction ended. The period historians call the nadir, the lowest point, began from 1877 to the 1920s. Lynchings became commonplace. Thousands were killed without trial, often publicly, as spectacles. The emerging system was almost indistinguishable from slavery, only now hidden behind legal formalities. Then history opened a window. In 1914, World War I began in Europe. Immigration from Europe, which had supplied northern factories with cheap labor for decades, suddenly stopped. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York desperately needed workers. At the same time, disaster struck the South: the boll weevil, a tiny beetle that destroys cotton. It came from Mexico, and in a few years devastated plantations from Texas to Georgia. Yields dropped 50 to 70%. Sharecroppers lost even the meager chance to survive. Then letters arrived from the North. The Chicago Defender, a black newspaper, began publishing job listings. Free copies were sent to the South. Come to Chicago, work in factories, earn $3 a day. Your children can go to school. For someone earning $30 a year on a cotton field, this sounded like a fairy tale. The Great Migration began, 1916–1970. 6 million people, from Mississippi to Chicago, from Alabama to Detroit, from Georgia to New York, from Louisiana to Los Angeles. They traveled by train, carrying cardboard suitcases, sometimes everything they owned. Many left at night secretly so the planter wouldn't find out, because Southerners tried to stop the outflow of labor. Northern recruiters were arrested, train conductors were intimidated, but the flow could not be stopped. Trains ran along routes echoing the old paths of the Underground Railroad, the Illinois Central Railroad from the Mississippi Valley to Chicago, the Pennsylvania Railroad from Virginia and the Carolinas to Philadelphia and New York, the Atlantic coastline from Florida and Georgia to the Northeast. The demographic map of America changed radically. In 1910, 90% of Black Americans lived in the South. By 1970, 50% lived in the North and West. Entire neighborhoods of northern cities transformed. Bronzeville in Chicago, Harlem in New York, Paradise Valley in Detroit. The North was no paradise. They faced redlining, banks refused mortgages in certain areas. They faced racial unrest. White residents did not want black neighbors. But one colossal breakthrough: political power. In the North, people could vote. When hundreds of thousands of new voters concentrated in key states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, politicians suddenly started to listen. But the most important thing the Great Migration gave was a cultural renaissance. The 1920s, Harlem, New York. Writers, poets, artists, musicians flocked to one neighborhood. The Harlem Renaissance emerged. Langston Hughes wrote poetry. Zora Neale Hurston wrote novels. Duke Ellington played jazz at the Cotton Club. For the first time, African American culture became not marginal but central to American culture. The blues, born in the fields of Mississippi, moved to Chicago. Electric guitars amplified the sound. Muddy Waters' Howlin' Wolf created Chicago blues, louder, tougher, urban. From the blues came rock roll. Chuck Berry, Little Richard took the blues structure and added energy. From jazz came big bands, swing, bebop. From gospel and rhythm and blues came soul. From soul emerged funk. From funk through the DJ culture of the Bronx came hip-hop. Each genre is a direct line with roots in the cotton fields. Songs sung in the fields became anthems of freedom. Languages created in isolation became tools of expression. Rhythms beaten out with the body when drums were banned became the foundation of all modern music. Today, 2025, cotton plantations are nearly gone. Machines do the work that once required thousands of hands. Yet the echo of that system is still audible. In the economy, the average wealth of a white family in the US is 10 times higher than that of a black family. This gap is the direct legacy of the promised 40 acres that were never given. Wealth accumulates across generations. If your ancestors could not own property, could not accumulate capital, this gap passes down. In geography, neighborhoods outlined by redlining in the 1930s remain the poorest areas of cities to this day. Inequality is literally drawn on the map. We started with a simple wooden box, machines with metal teeth. Eli Whitney thought he was inventing a labor-saving tool. Instead, he created a mechanism that turned millions of people into commodities, that divided a nation, that led to war. But the same system gave rise to a culture of resistance so powerful it changed the world. History is not just the past, it is a living process. Its echo resonates in every heartbeat of modern America. And the path to freedom, begun in 1819, continues to this day. Its echo resonates in every heartbeat of modern America. And the path to freedom, begun in 1819, continues to this day.